Thank you very much for the wonderful welcome. It is good to be back here. It is indeed a remarkable honor to be here today, to be asked and selected to come and share a few words on this remarkable day. Um, as you know, I'm from a country that has dealt with a lot of uh, difficulties, particularly throughout my own life. I don't recall a moment throughout my very short life where there's been a day or some moment in the history of my country that we are proud of, even to the current one. And this always begs the question of leadership for me. And sometimes it is good to have examples, as Dr. King, to go back to hope and believe that there are individuals who can make a change in the world, in communities, and who have the ability to tap into people's belief that things haven't become useless, or that they haven't come to an end, that there is always a possibility that lies somewhere for something to change. Now, in coming here to speak today, I've thought long and hard about what it is that I would speak about in regards to Dr. King. And I began to read a little bit more, to look at the history, to look at Dr. King's words, his speeches, his writings, and everything. And I began to understand a few things, which is that how all of this began, in my opinion, is because of the power of words and the intellectual rigor, curiosity, and the ability to think differently, even if it's not popular, that Dr. King had that made the difference. And from there on came the possibility of action and the change that occurred. If he and people who surrounded him did not have that character, that fortitude, they wouldn't have been able to live us with the legacy that we continue to live and to pursue and to find justice and equality for all. So, as a writer, of course, this appealed to me tremendously. And as a storyteller, I also came to understand that Dr. King was not only a man of words, of intellectual curiosity, of courage, but also a wonderful orator. A man who could take simple words and lodge them into the spirit of people, into their souls, into their very veins and bloodstream, that he would never be able to depart again, that it would stay with them for generations to come. I have heard the words, "I have a dream," in a place like Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, where a child who is an orphan living in an orphanage has nothing, somehow learned these words of Dr. King and recite them every day. And that was his hope that gave him the strength to live every day. Sometimes I don't think he even understood all of the complexities of the words he was uttering, but there was a feeling about how Dr. King delivered it that made a difference to this young boy. I come from Sierra Leone, that you've heard of, that also has a history with the United States. There were people brought from Sierra Leone to the United States, to the South, particularly during slavery, in the Carolinas particularly. And to this day, if you go to the Gula communities in the Carolinas, people speak languages, Creole, that are very similar to mine, that I can understand very well. And people were brought because of, in Sierra Leone, we live on the coast and we know how to plant rice. It's our staple food. And for that skill set, a lot of slaves were brought. When slavery ended, a lot of people were sent back to West Africa. We have Liberia, Monrovia, the capital after President Monroe. We have Freetown, which was a place where if you went as a slave, you'd be freed. So there is a connection to this history for me, a personal one. And when I came to live in the United States, I was adopted into a family to start a second chance at life again in this country. I took that very seriously. I began to look around and see that I was seeing long lost brothers and sisters. Sometimes in New York on the subway, I would look at some people And I swore I wanted to tell them, I know one of your family members somewhere in Sierra Leone, but I felt the history has been broken too long that sentence would not do me any good. So I restrained myself from doing so. But I stand here before you today to explain to you and to further push that hope. It's there. It is strong, and hope it's possible because there are people who refuse to believe that humanity is heading for destruction, who refuse to come to terms with the fact that each human being, the light of their spirit can completely diminish, that there's always a possibility that it can be reignited again, whether through how you change the way they think about things, their perception, or through how you make them feel that their humanity is worth something. I come from that background. There was a point in my life when everybody, a good number of people, disbelieved that somebody like me could be possible, and here I am standing in front of you. So there's hope. And hope sometimes is not just the words themselves, it also comes with action. People who believe these things get up and do something with it. God gave us that capacity to do so. Not just to think that, oh, I'm very hopeful that things are going to change and sit at home. It's not going to happen. There has to be some things that you do to make that happen. For me personally, people have been able to do that. One of Dr. King's words that I want to lodge into your memory as I continue to speak, is something that means a lot to me, are these words. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. I will say it again so that it can take a root into your spirit. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And all of us sitting here, there are things that matter to us. There are different ways that we interpret what matters to us, but when it comes down to it, it is the same. Is that we do have faith in humanity. We want to live peacefully together. Some of us may not know how to do it, but if we listen to each other, we look at each other, into each other's humanity, we put away our preconceived ideas of who people are, we'll be able to get beyond that and see that we are all the same. We all want the same things. Culturally, communally, societally, we can interpret those wants differently, but it comes down to it. Nobody wants to wake up in the morning in a place where they're going to have a life that is filled with strife and difficulty and violence and things of that nature. Everybody wants to wake up in the morning and have peace in their lives. Nobody wants to have a phone call of something bad. All of us have that desire to have peace in our communities, to live peacefully. And I believe that is a common place where we can all come together and start from. These are some of the visions that Dr. King had, and that I hope will continue to have in us. But I'm going to go back to the power of words that I had mentioned earlier. When I came to this country, after a very difficult life, I had managed to begin building the skeletal remains of the hope that had been left within me, to put some flesh and blood and veins and things of that nature in it again. I boarded a plane, and in those days I wasn't a traveler, a seasoned traveler, so I did not know about the things that you could do with your luggage. I had very few things. One was had two shirts, two pairs of pants, one that I was wearing, and I packed these things in a big suitcase that I happened to have. Somebody gave it to me, and I checked it in. When I arrived at JFK, this bag did not come. Other people's bags came that were much bigger and seemingly heavier than mine. And so I walked into this country with just a passport, my Sierra Leone passport, and my mother, the woman who became my mother, waiting to receive me into her life. This was the gesture that she did that changed my life tremendously. Because for me, I was looking for family again, something that I'd lost completely, that I didn't know how to get back. I came into her life, a small context about coexisting together. I grew up in Sierra Leone that has a very strong religious tolerance. You know, when you go to a gathering in Sierra Leone, people will read the Lord's Prayer and they'll read the Al-Fatiha, which is the Muslim prayer. And as both children growing up, we knew both. And when other people would come to our communities, they would be very confused that we were reciting both. They would look at us and be like, okay, something is wrong here. But in Sierra Leone, we have a very funny joke that we say, we would embrace any religion that comes as long as it has the core principle of treating somebody else as you would treat yourself. And we would embrace it. And the joke goes that you do not know on Judgment Day who is right. If the Christians are right, we say amen, because we already know the Bible. If the Muslims are right, we say inshallah. You know. So we grew up with this sort of belief, this tolerance. So I grew up, I went to Quranic school. I learned the Quran. My grandfather was an imam, and he was good friends with the pastor and the reverend in town. So because of that, he convinced them, and they sent me to a Christian secondary school, and I read the Bible, and I even preached the Sermon on the Mount at some point to everybody, and then I'll go back and pray with my grandfather. When I came to the United States, the family that took me in was a Jewish family, and I lived with them. And this Jewish family didn't stop at being Jewish, they also began practicing Buddhism. So then I went to some of the places that they practice. So the reason why I'm explaining these things to you, that sometimes in our minds and in our conceptions, we think things are impossible, that they cannot function in the realities that we know. But when you stop to think about it and you begin to take anecdotes of people's lives who have come before us, they have faced insurmountable challenges and have been able to rise to the occasion by using words, by beginning to stir up the spirit of people around them with the power of words. I'm a writer, and that's what exactly I try to do with my own experiences, to make sure that when people think of a particular single incident, they can put a human face to it, so that it's no longer just left with that thing that happens there, but rather this thing that happens to the brother, sister that we know, or it could have been us. So for me, when I looked at Dr. King's words, these are the things that it does for me. He had that ability to not just use words to move people, but to also listen to his adversaries, to people who thought differently, to people who challenged him, to people who hated him, and people who wanted to kill him. He had the ability to listen to them, to see where they were coming from, to understand their thought process, in order to be able to respond to them in ways that spoke to their humanity. Sometimes they did not hear it, but over time, it began to sink in with some people. And these words became the very, I don't want to use the word weapon, but I would use it in this context. It became the very weapon that defeated the hatred that was already there. In his words, he says, the ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Dr. King. I know these words firsthand because I'm coming from a background where I've been unfortunate in one way of looking at it, but also fortunate to see how human beings can go from love to true evil madness. And I've been on both sides of that. I grew up as a child in a very loving community where nobody would raise their voice to anybody who was older than them, where anybody who was older than you was your mother and father. We did not have any other words for them. In my community where I come from in Sierra Leone, we don't have words for extended family members. We don't have second cousin, third cousin from my mother. For us, these are things that says, I don't want to call you until maybe Christmas. I don't want to talk to you. So for us, it means that you're either a brother or a sister, you're a father or mother, depending on your age. So I grew up in this community, and if anybody would have told us that violence was possible here, we wouldn't have believed them at all, and we didn't. But when the violence came, some of us found out that we have the capacity to succumb to it, to live in it fully. And I became one of those people. When I was a young boy, I would go and recite Shakespeare. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, have come to bury Caesar. Not long after that, I now had an AK-47, and I could do whatever I want with anybody that I encountered. Because that's what I'd come to believe, that now this weapon was what I could use to get whatever I wanted, to revenge the death of my family members. But I learned something in that process that stayed with me, which is that each time that we went out to shoot at other people and kill them because of what had happened to us, we created the reason for others to join, just like us, and go after people like us. And in the process, when we went to seek this revenge, we possibly were destroying people who had nothing to do with what had happened to us. But when they retaliated, they increased the level of the violence. And when we came in return, we increased the level of violence. So we ended up in my country, Sierra Leone, having a cycle of violence that just escalated and escalated until somebody was willing to step out of that cycle and put the weapon down and say, no, if we continue this way, we all are going to perish. It was going to continue. And thank God it didn't continue. The war in my country went on for about 11 years. And through that time, everything changed. Even nature itself in my country was afraid during the war. This is how bad it was. The birds would not sing anymore. All the animals departed. When night came, the stars were hiding in the sky. You could see that even the air itself had become violent. You know, when the breeze came about, you felt as if something was going to choke you. You know, so I know about these words. I take these words very strongly. Now, when I came from Sierra Leone, even though I'd experienced violence, I'd not experienced discrimination because of how I looked. The first time that happened to me was actually in South Africa. I had left my country, Sierra Leone, as a refugee. I was going from one country to another illegally most of the time. I went into other countries, snuck through borders, and when I was leaving, sometimes I was asked how I had ended up in that country. I was there physically, but they could not determine how I entered because there was no record. And I always say to them, but I'm leaving now, so it's no longer a crime. I can leave, you know. Sometimes this humor that did not serve me well. And other times, some people looked at me and thought, all right, this fellow has nothing to lose, and they let me go. I ended up in South Africa, all the way, if you know the African map, I went from West Africa all the way to South Africa. And around this time, I was about 16, 17, and I was moving constantly by myself. So when I was in South Africa, I had a friend who was an Afrikaans fellow. And I stayed in the neighborhood where he was living, and he was my friend. My very good friend. But he did not explain the context of South Africa at the time to me. This was around 1996, 97. So I'm there in this neighborhood, and one day I come home, he's not there, and I'm standing right there. You know, everybody has these security systems in their homes, and I press it, and all of a sudden, an assault vehicle of policemen shows up. They had serious weaponry, you know, bulletproof vest. Somebody had called them and said they saw someone in the neighborhood who did not belong. And they put me on the gunpoint. They put guns to my head, and I put my hand up, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I thought I ran away from this in my country, but nonetheless, here I am. I had a sense of humor about things at this point in my life because I'd been through so much. I thought it can't possibly get worse, you know. So as they pointed the guns at me, and they asked me, "What are you doing here in South Africa?" They have other words that they call black people. They will call you kafir. So they say, "What are you doing here, kafir?" And I spoke, and I said, "I actually live here." And they say, "No, you don't live here." And I said, "Well, why do you think that I don't live here?" "But because your kind doesn't live here." And I said, "Oh, my kind." And something went on in my head. I thought, "Oh, what is my kind?" It was the first time for me that my humanity has been questioned to that because of how I looked. Because where I was coming from in Sierra Leone, even though we had a civil war and everything, everybody looked the same. So I guess we didn't really have that issue of other people different from us. So anyway, as I was standing there with my hands up and speaking, and they lowered their weapons. And I thought to myself, well, that is very strange. And they started saying, "Oh, you are not from here." And I said, yes, I'm not from here. I said, "Because of your accent." And something went inside my head that was of twofold. The first was that I was happy that they lowered their weapons. Definitely. But the second part of it, that I was very disturbed that it was because I was not from there. What if I was from there and I looked the way I looked? What would have happened to me? So this is the second thought that disturbed me the most. And I thought to myself, why do we live in a world where your humanity and your worthiness is judged by how you look, or by how people's perception of the way you look would reflect on how you behave and the things that you do? And I've had to encounter this even to this day. So the work of Martin Luther King is not over. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to change people's mindset in the most simple daily deliberations of our lives. These things come up because prejudice is very difficult to cure, because sometimes it's very private, and if you're not the one being affected by it, you do not see it sometimes. So whenever you see somebody being upset, people say, "Why is this person is always upset?" What you don't know is just that they cannot take it anymore. How many times have I come to a place sometimes to give a talk, and people will ask me, "Are you here with catering? Or are you here as one of the musicians?" And I will say to them, "No, I can play the drums, but I'm not here for that today." Because I always find humor also as a medicine, as a way to sometimes have people truly understand and open them up to have a discussion. I remember I was in Greenbrier in Virginia one time to give a talk along with Kofi Annan, former UN Secretary General. And I arrived, and all of a sudden they said to me, "Oh, you can go, the kitchen is there, you can go and change." And I thought to myself, all right, I'm really going to go and try and change. See, maybe I can make some money, you know, because I'm not on the payroll, you know. So I went and said, you know, I'm here for, they sent me to the kitchen, you know. And they said to me, "What's your name?" And I said, "My name is Ishmael Beah." And they said, "Okay, put on this thing." I said, "All right." And then what do I do? And they said, "Oh, this is how you serve this." And I walked in the front, you know, started making the tables. And the woman who had put the talk together said to me, "What are you doing? This is our speaker. Why are you setting the tables?" You know. And everybody in the place looked around, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh, you are the speaker. Oh, but who told you to come here?" And I said, "Somebody told me to come here." I didn't name the person, of course, because I didn't want them to lose their job. I realized that, you know, this again comes to what I said, is that I could have fought hate with hate, or what was being done to me was the same thing. And this person who knew they had a family, they would have lost their job. But what I was able to do was, during my talk, was able to speak about this, use this as an anecdote to explain that you cannot judge people just by the way they look. You must ask them, Speak to them, listen to them. Allow yourself to see their humanity. And then, if you want to make any judgment, you can. This takes me back to Dr. King's idea of education. It's intelligence plus character. All of us can read things in books, but not very many people have the capacity to discern it, think about it deeply, and understand it. And these are things that are very important to me. These are things that come with people's love to understand words, to go beyond what is just said, what is not said, to think deeply about situations. Nowadays, particularly for the younger generation here today, we have lost some of this ability to think differently, to think deeply. Everyone wants to think the same. If you don't think like everybody else, you're unpopular. I used to be one of these young people in my university days, and people would say to me, "You're such a weird guy." And I would say to them, I don't like that word. I actually prefer the word unusual. It has more elegance. It doesn't have this negative connotation to weirdness. Because I didn't walk the path, I always ask questions. If somebody said to me, "Well, we must always go this way through this door," I say, "Why? Who said so? Why are we doing it?" I always ask questions. And I try to apply the things that I learned to the daily deliberations of my life to make myself useful. I believe our lives are only valuable if we are useful to others and ourselves. If not, I don't think I want my life if I can't make it useful to anybody. This brings me to this idea of, again, from Dr. King, about a speech he gave in Detroit in 1954 about rediscovering lost values, going back to the past, looking at it, grappling with it to understand the present, to make sense of the present, not just reading it, reciting it, but really, truly thinking about it. And this particular speech, when I read it, it applies today. You know, why is it that we are still in a world where human beings think of each other differently? Why we live in a world today where you have two young men in Paris who pick a weapon and go shoot up a place? And when discussions come about that, people blame it on radicalism, Islam, Muslims. Again, it goes back to how we don't think deeply about situations. The question I asked myself, I was in Paris when this happened, the first question I asked myself, what happens in France when two young boys born and raised in France choose to do something like this? It means that the community, France, has failed these young people. There's nowhere in the world where a person will grow up and embrace violence if they have a clear choice between another alternative that's good for them. Often when people think about it, oh, these people, they just wake up one morning, nobody does that. I have been in violence. I'm not giving you a theory or research paper. If you have a clear choice between waking up, having opportunity, real opportunity in your life, doing something with yourself, you cannot adhere to any nonsense or anybody's radicalism or anything like that because you have things to do with your life. When you don't, you're ostracized from society, you don't feel belonged. You're going to look for a community. And in that process, whoever comes first and has the capacity to convince you that this is the community you must be part of, you would embrace it fully. I did that in the war in Sierra Leone. When everything was destroyed, my choice was to join, to fight. As a 13-year-old boy, I did that, and the army became my new family. So sometimes when we speak, people say, "Je suis Charlie," freedom, freedom of speech. These are words that we throw out without even thinking about what does that mean? What does liberty mean? It doesn't mean that we can do what we want, but it also means that we must be aware that there are other people who also need to practice their liberty and their freedom. And my liberty comes at an end or becomes questioned, I have to think about it or be aware of it a little bit when it crosses into the liberty of somebody else's. Otherwise, if we just let everybody go out and do whatever you like, it doesn't matter. We'll have chaos in the world. So, my conclusion today is this. I want us to be mindful about each other. I want us to try and think differently. I want us to take Martin Luther King's words, Dr. King's words, and replay them in our heads again. And think about the world we live in and know and find out how we can be useful. Constantly challenge things that you're told, things that you hear. Don't settle for a quick fix. It does not work. It never works. So, I want us to be mindful to others, to be curious about others before making judgments. I'm an immigrant, when I came to the United States, and I remember when there was this whole immigration discussion in Arizona, and I happened to go there for a literary festival, and people were so upset, people like me. Oh, you come to our country and you take our jobs. At this point, I had become a U.S. citizen, so I was like, well, I'm one of you guys now. So, but people would be very upset at immigrants coming. And then when you ask them, do you know what the life of an immigrant is? They do not know. But the hate comes without any strong fact, without any factual check. It's purely based on emotion, misguided emotion. So they were reacting. And so when I explained to them, let me explain to you what it means to be an immigrant. Imagine you come to a country like the United States where you're looking to make a life for yourself. And you're given 3 months. You come, you settle. Within 3 months, you're on your own. And within those 3 months, you're given very little from the government, which is still a lot, because most countries don't do that. And then you're supposed to figure it out. Now tell me, how many people who are born and raised in this country for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they can figure it out? And you come from another culture, language barrier, you're supposed to figure it out in 3 months. And then all of a sudden people say, oh, you came and you took our jobs. What jobs? Jobs that you did not want to start with. You understand? So when the discussion begins, you realize that what has happened, the other side did not take the time to understand the other. They just reacted. And this often gives birth to hate unnecessarily. So my plea to you, if you don't agree with somebody, have a conversation with them. Be willing to have a really, truly, a true conversation with them about what you think and what they think. And if they're able to convince you, embrace their thought. If not, challenge their thought, maybe convince them to come to your side. But never jump to conclusions about somebody without doing your homework. Now, I could go on and on, of course, but I also learned certain things in my very short life. Been privileged to be amongst wonderful people like Nelson Mandela, and also read history from people like Dr. King. I realized that when you speak, and also coming from the tradition that I'm come from, the oral tradition, you must not exhaust people when you speak to them. You must leave them thinking with you. You must not speak to them until the point that they are thinking of doing something else besides the conversation that you're having with them. So with that said, I do hope that the few words that I've been able to share with you this morning would trigger conversation, more thought, the desire to know people, the desire to open yourself to other cultures, the desire to make yourself useful in your community, the desire to find justice, equality, truth, peace, intellectual rigor, curiosity in our world, not just in our community, but in our world. The world is getting smaller and smaller. So I'm sure in this crowd here, if we ask, there are people from different parts of the world. But I'll leave you with one quote from Dr. King in closing. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Thank you.